Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, Jonathan Steele. On tonight's programme, we'll be taking a look at the rise of the far right in Germany, and there'll be updates from Chechnya, from developments from over the weekend. But first, an Iranian-born cleric, Haron Monis, who was granted asylum in Australia, was identified as the hostage taker in one of Australia's biggest security scares to be seen for decades. The Sydney siege is now over, after police commandos stormed the café earlier today. Ahmad has been following developments.
This camera is
The Australian city of Sydney has been in lockdown for the last 24 hours, as hostages have been held by an armed man inside a Lindt café. Emergency services were called in, with images being released showing the hostages with their hands in the air, and two females holding an Islamic Shahada flag against the café window. Officers cordoned off several blocks around the café as negotiators tried to defuse one of the biggest security scares in Australia for decades. Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott urged for calm and urged Australians to go about the business as usual.
We have to appreciate that even in a society such as ours, there are people who would wish to do us harm. That's why we have police and security organisations of the utmost professionalism that are ready and able to respond to a whole range of situations and contingencies, including the situation that we are now seeing in Sydney.
At around 3 p.m, a breakthrough came for the police, with 3 hostages being released from the café. 2 hours later, a further 2 hostages were released, both staff members. There are believed to be no more than 30 hostages held. While it has been a tense situation for the Australian community, the saga has been particularly precarious for the roughly 500,000 Muslim population to which the hostage taker is associated with. Many around the country have been on high alert, fearing reprisals.
Oh, it is worrying me actually, as as me as a Muslim, if because he didn't represent me, and if he think that he's a Muslim, is doing the right thing, then for us it's very bad, because that's not us, not the Muslims that are doing this.
One Sydney Muslim resident in Australia posted on Facebook that his wife was told to go to hell upon her return to Sydney at the airport. However, incidents such as these have been few, with many Australians displaying huge support for the Muslim community currently embroiled in the saga. On Twitter, the hashtag #I'llRideWithYou trended worldwide, where Sydney locals offered to travel with Muslims wearing Islamic dress after concerns that they would be harassed because of it.
It's been a very difficult time for the Muslim community in Australia, and it hasn't been helped by some in the tabloid media who fanned racist attacks against Islamic Australians. But I'm pleased to say that some prominent Australians today, such as Steve Waugh, the former Australian cricket captain, and a number of other Australians have indicated very publicly on Twitter and other places that what is important is to stand firm with Islamic Australians and ensure that we see this incident for what it is, which is that a terribly unfortunate, tragic incident.
Concerns about an attack in Australia by radical Muslims have been growing for more than a year, with the security agency raising its national terrorism public alert to high in September. In that month, Australian anti-terrorism police said they thwarted an imminent threat to behead a random member of the public, and days later, a teenager in Melbourne was shot dead after attacking 2 officers with a knife. There is still no indication that this was a terrorist operation rather than a lone wolf attack, as details continue to emerge. What is known of the actions of this individual is that it will not help the already precarious situation that Muslims face in Australia. Ahmad, The Report.
Well, with me to discuss this affair is Dr. Raveem Ismail, Terrorism and War, Underwriting and Analyst, and the journalist Reged Ahmad. Reged, let me start with you. I mean, the fact that it seems this man had a personal agenda and a lot of serious family issues, isn't that quite a source of relief for Australian Muslims that it wasn't political or Islamist, in fact?
I think so. I think it was very clear from the start that we just didn't know who this person was, what they stood for, and I think that most of the Australian media and the authorities were very careful to keep that in mind as well. And you could see that from the language that the authorities were using. And now it's become clear that this man seems to have his own personal issues, doesn't seem to be very stable. And it's quite clear that you can't say that this is a man acting on behalf of any sort of terrorist organisation, certainly not with the information we have at the moment.
But he did, unfortunately, put up an Islamic flag, so he was trying in some way to identify himself with an Islamic movement, it seems.
Yes, that's right. Again, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that there's been so much about Islamic State and terrorism in the Australian media and international media. We're hearing a lot about it. So there might be some who would argue that they're working for certain terrorist organisations, or there might be some people who are quite disturbed, see that that's a very prominent message and realise, well, that's a message I can tag along with in order to get some sort of public attention.
No, Dr. Raveem, let me come to you now. I mean, Australia is miles and miles away from the Middle East, and yet Tony Abbott has seen fit to join in the US-led coalition against ISIS. I mean, do you think that is a mistake and that he's creating a kind of, blowback in Australia, which was not necessary to have?
I mean, as Reged says, there are unfortunately many people who wish to now attach themselves to the cause célèbre of something like ISIS in order to further publicity.
I think we're going to have to cut you off, Dr. Raveem. There's a problem with your connection. Let me come back while we try and fix that to Reged. The point I was trying to make in the question was, Australia's miles from the Middle East, has no real interests in the Middle East. Is it a mistake for Tony Abbott to have committed his government to helping in the fight against ISIS on the ground?
I think it's very difficult to say. I think on the one hand, you've got the intelligence that authorities are privy to that the public isn't. They may know that there is something going on in Australia, and then there's the international rhetoric, the public statements, and the commitment to resources as well. I think that it's a question for the government as to whether they want to be seen to be part of that policy on an international level, and there is going to be some sort of implications at home, whether it's for the Muslim community, for people who may take it as a challenge almost. On the flip side, what happens if Australia doesn't get involved? You might argue that there's a lot of international pressure for Western countries who would argue they share the same values to take note of what's happening overseas and to be involved rather than shut down and say, it's not my problem, I'm not going to do anything about it. But
are there recent opinion polls that show whether a majority of Australians actually do support the engagement of their country in the fight against ISIS?
I haven't seen those opinion polls, and I think they would be very interesting to see. I don't know how many Australians pay attention to this sort of news. I think a lot of the coverage that you often see in Australian media can be very much about Australian politics. So how much people are aware of what's happening internationally, interested and have an opinion on it is a good question, and we should look at figures for that. I think that people are generally aware of what's happening, and I can't imagine the government would take a policy decision that was hugely unpopular in Australia.
Okay, I think we may have Dr. Raveem back again. Let me put to you the whole issue of the reaction in the first hours when this came up. I mean, on the one hand, there seemed to have been a little spurt of Islamophobia. On the other hand, some leading Australians came out saying that this was quite unjustified and they stood side by side with the Muslim community. So in a way, is there a sort of good outcome from this whole episode today in that it is put a majority of Australians on the side of the Islamic community rather than seeing them as being hounded?
I mean, that's definitely one positive that comes out of the extra media attention that Muslims get after any event like this. And it's pleasing to see not just prominent but ordinary Australians coming out in support. But bear in mind the reaction within the Muslim community whenever something like this happens and the perpetrator is not yet known. It's, please God, let it not be a Muslim that's done this, because Muslims are already suffering overmuch from the media attention that comes from this, and the oxygen of publicity has not really been denied to anybody who wants to do any criminal act and then attach themselves to Islamic State in the most superficial way sometimes. As has been mentioned, Australia is thousands of miles away from the arenas of war.
Have some Australian Muslims gone out to Iraq and Syria to help with on the fight on the side of Islamic State?
Yes, so that has happened, and bear in mind here in the UK as well that has happened, and indeed one of the questions that cropped up in my industry is what's the threat to the United Kingdom and its infrastructure from returning jihadists from places like Syria, and Australia shares those concerns. But the security services routinely issue the alerts that you've mentioned, the various red or amber, green status, in order to assure the public that despite the fact that they may not be seeing anything, they're constantly at work foiling plots and that sort of thing. As regards whether any of these people are a threat to Australia when coming back, that's a mixed bag, because a lot of the time they've gone out there specifically to the theatre of war to accomplish something there as opposed to back home. Some of them have, in a bit of a ritual, burnt their passports over there.
Well, Reged, let me come back to you. This man, it seems we're getting more and more information as time goes on about who he is and his background and so on. And it does seem he's had several brushes with the law, been convicted or charged at least with violent offences of one kind or another. Should the police have, been able to stop him doing what he's done, do you think? I mean, is there some problem here that the police fell down a little bit on their responsibilities?
I think that that's a question that's going to be asked over several days. I've been reading that he was known to police, that he was in trouble for sending threatening letters to prominent people in the past. He seems to have some sort of fixation on Tony Abbott. So certainly there might be the question, should he have been watched more closely? Should there have been more surveillance? Having said that, police do a lot of surveillance in Australia, and within the law and in terms of respecting people's privacy, I think police do have strong powers, certainly in New South Wales. So I'm not sure whether the conversation will go towards giving police more powers, but I do wonder if people are going to ask questions about whether police should have had this man in their radar. And
does the Muslim community in Australia feel, over the last year or two, more and more under threat, or do they feel, that the public is becoming better sort of educated and aware of these issues and prejudice is declining?
I think there's been a history of difficult relationships. In the last decade, we did see Cronulla riots where there was some tension between Muslim and Lebanese community and the white Australian community. So it's been bubbling under the surface. What's interesting to see with this example is that the Muslim community came out very quickly with a press release saying we denounce what's happening, and there was some almost 50 signatories to that press release. So I think that they're very aware that they need to, or they feel they need to react very quickly. I think your package mentioned the I'll Ride With You hashtag. That component of social media, I think, is doing a lot in terms of bringing different sections of the community together and making people, bringing people into a dialogue. As to whether Muslims are feeling more afraid or less, I haven't spoken to a cross-section of the Muslim community, but I would imagine that with more and more reporting about Islamic State and the policy decisions that the government has made, you would think that there is a sort of a watchful concern amongst the community.
Well, Reged, Ahmad, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Dr. Raveem Ismail. We'll be following developments on this story, of course, as more and more unfolds, so do keep a watch for updates. Before we go to a break, let's take a look at what you've been saying on Twitter. At Arab Tomnes tweeted about the Sydney siege, saying, "Sydney siege, he wants an IS flag delivered. You're not being very convincing as a terrorist when you have to ask the police for a flag." This came after reports that the hostage taker had requested the police bring him an IS flag. After a Muslim woman was verbally abused on public transport in Australia following news of the siege, the "I'll ride with you" hashtag was thought up as a show of solidarity with the Muslim community, and Sydney residents tweeted that they would travel with anyone fearful of Islamophobic attacks. At Ayawande Jing tweeted, "I'll ride with you and walk, sit, run and surf with you," with at Cass Clementi tweeting, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." At I'll Ride With You international recognition came courtesy of many tweeters expressing emotion at the sentiment. At Ibrahim Mahmoud tweets, "Words fail to explain how much simple statements and acts of solidarity against hate are so vital. Very moving." And finally, I'll Ride With You has a final tweet on a slightly different topic. At Mohammed Amin, chair of the Muslim Conservative Forum here in Britain, tweets about Germany following an anti-Islamic marches over the weekend. He said, "Pleased that Angela Merkel condemned anti-Muslim hatred in Dresden. I believe German Muslims must participate politically." And we'll be discussing that exact topic after the break, so do join us then.